If you're looking for a scary Halloween story, this one is legitimately terrifying, especially if you have small children. Because what happened to little Karen Mauk in Pennsylvania Steel Country back in 1954 could happen anytime, anywhere. Sources and research notes are available at grimsilence.com, and if you are interested in true crime that's older and more obscure, please be sure to like and subscribe. The small Pennsylvania community of K Township sits nestled in the hills and woodlands just outside of Johnstown, a once thriving community that benefited from the rise of steel and coal a century ago, but whose population now continues to inch lower and lower every year. Located about an hour and a half east of Pittsburgh, life in Conemaugh has changed a lot since the 1950s, when the mighty Bethlehem Steel Corporation was the region's biggest employer. But what has certainly not changed is the time-honored tradition of Halloween. Just as they do today, children here in 1954 looked forward to late October as a time for putting up festive Halloween decorations, dressing up for neighborhood costume parties, and on October 31st, zigzagging across familiar neighborhood streets to collect Halloween candy from friendly neighbors. One little girl in particular absolutely loved the Halloween season. Late October wasn't just for trick-or-treating. It was also when this precious child celebrated her birthday. Little Karen Mauk, the daughter of a Bethlehem steelworker, turned 6 years old on October 25th, 1954. Exactly how she celebrated this momentous occasion is unknown, but with 4 brothers, 2 sisters, and a mother and father who adored her, it seems safe to say that she was surrounded by love when she blew out the candles on her birthday cake. 3 days later, on October 28th, Halloween celebrations were Karen's one and only concern. That night, she would be attending a Halloween party, and her mother had prepared a beautiful fairy gown for the occasion. But the party wouldn't be starting until a bit later, and Karen had decided that she would warm up for the festivities by doing some pre-Halloween trick-or-treating. After all, it was October 28th, and it was practically Halloween. And who could resist a little girl in a costume asking for candy no matter what day it was? Karen's mother did not like this idea. She had a PTA meeting to attend, the PTA being the local school's parent-teacher association, and Mr. Mauk was at home looking after the rest of the Mauk children who just weren't quite as enthusiastic about trick-or-treating as little Karen was. But Karen said she wouldn't be alone. Her cousin Paul, who was also 6 years old, lived just down the street and he would be joining her. The thought of her 6-year-old daughter being escorted around the neighborhood by another 6-year-old did not fill Mrs. Mauk with confidence. Again, she said no to Karen's trick-or-treating proposal. But Karen was persistent, and she pleaded with her mother, and she pleaded some more. Mrs. Mauk eventually relented. Karen was saving her special fairy gown for the big party that night, so Mrs. Mauk fitted her little girl with a white false face, which was the 1950s term for a mask, and a paper hat. Completing the outfit was an old purple dress that Mrs. Mauk quickly modified for her daughter's tiny frame. Karen was delighted, and at about 6:30 p.m., she ran to get her cousin Paul for some pre-Halloween fun. Karen and Paul knocked on some doors and began filling their Halloween bags with treats. But it wasn't long before Paul's mother called him home. Paul had been out long enough, explained his mother to a disappointed Karen, her niece, who sullenly returned home. By 7:30 that night, Karen's mother was about to depart for her PTA meeting, and Karen was begging to be let out yet again, this time with a small group of neighborhood girls. Karen's mother gave her blessing, a decision she would later regret. Local newspapers didn't report when or how Karen Mauk got separated from her group, but they did get separated. 2 hours had passed since Karen's departure for her second round of trick-or-treating with the neighborhood girls, and Karen's mother arrived home from her PTA meeting to find out that Karen had not yet returned, and shortly thereafter she called the police. Upon hearing the news that Karen was missing, town officials, in a very literal sense, sounded the alarm. They activated the local fire department's fire whistle and quickly gathered a posse of nearly 100 volunteers made up of firefighters and concerned neighbors. The group fanned out across town to search for the missing girl. Later that night, just after midnight, a heartbreaking discovery was made. 2 miles from Karen Mauk's home, little Karen's lifeless body was discovered just inside the entrance to the St. Petka Cemetery. Here is how the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette described the scene. The body, stripped of all clothing but socks and shoes, was found lying face up in the tall grass of the St. Petka Serbian cemetery. Her clothing, torn and muddy, was strewn around the body, and nearby police found the paper trick-or-treat bag, its pathetic contents of candy and fruit scattered on the rain-soaked ground. Conemaugh Police Chief George Fesco reported that Karen's face and body were bruised, and that she had blood running from her mouth. A particularly chilling detail of this gruesome discovery was reported by the Pittsburgh Press, stating that her hands were tightly clenched around clumps of the weeds. According to investigators, the little girl had been thrown down a hillside, tumbling some 30 feet, or about 9 meters, before she was smothered to death, most likely with a coat or some other article of heavy clothing. I also want to note that the coroner himself actually misspoke and said that the body had been strangled when the official ruling was suffocation, which is why a lot of the reporting on this seems to get the two confused, although suffocation and strangulation are clearly two very different things. Local reporting on the Cambria County coroner's examination was mixed. Many articles stated that the coroner found no evidence that the child had been criminally attacked and there were no marks of violence on the body. But both of these conclusions are very starkly contradicted by other news articles claiming the exact opposite. As for how reports of the same event could be so wildly different, I suppose it's possible that a news correspondent somewhere may have decided to sterilize certain parts of the reporting so as not to upset the delicate sensibilities of local housewives who might faint upon hearing upsetting news about a child. We are, after all, talking about the Beaver Cleaver era of the 1950s. Conversely, one could also argue that an overzealous news editor had decided to sensationalize the crime with lurid details. Regardless, nobody disputed Police Chief Fesco's position on the matter, which was, number 1, the murder of Karen Mauk was the brutal work of a sex maniac, and number 2, all known sex degenerates in the area needed to be rounded up. If this language seems a bit over the top and almost comical coming from a government official, that's because by today's standards, it kind of is. But back in the 1950s, sex maniacs and sex degenerates were the rapists and sex offenders of the time, although I'm not entirely sure of which is which. Whatever you might think of Chief Fesco's choice of words, the man clearly knew what he was doing. At least 24 sex degenerates were interviewed, and the police received a tip about a neighbor who lived near the Mauk household. 39-year-old Harry Gossard, who once worked on an Atlantic oil refining company tanker, was described in most reporting as a merchant seaman. He was unemployed, twice divorced, and living with his mother. Their home was close to the Mauks, and Karen Mauk's mother actually said of Gossard's mother, "I have known her for a number of years, and she is a lovely person." And yes, Gossard was indeed a sex degenerate, as he had at least one unspecified sex crime on the books, in addition to other infractions, including a stint in federal prison for stealing from the mail. There were two particularly damning pieces of evidence against Gossard. One of them was Karen's paper hat, which was discovered about 50 yards away from Gossard's home. The other piece of evidence was tire tracks found near the spot where Karen Mauk's body was discovered. Investigators made a plaster cast of the tracks, which honestly sounds like pretty fancy police work for the time. Remember, we are talking about the 1950s. And it's a good thing they did this because after discovering the body, a couple of hours later, there was a heavy rain, which would have washed those tracks away. But they got the tracks in the plaster cast, and the tracks matched the tires on Gossard's car. Police reportedly interrogated Gossard for 24 hours before he confessed to luring the unsuspecting 6-year-old into his car with the promise of money for her Halloween trick-or-treat bag. And in addition to one article stating that Gossard admitted to, quote, indecent and immoral acts on Karen Mauk, another article says that he told a panel of 3 judges that he had had abnormal sex relations with the little girl, but that he did not rape her. He also claimed that he blacked out only to awake and find the child dead. Now, as one would expect, the local community was furious about the death of this little girl. Threats were made against Gossard's life, and he was kept under heavy guard throughout the investigation and subsequent court hearings. Gossard eventually signed a confession and entered a guilty plea, leading him to be sentenced to die in the electric chair. However, one last appeal was attempted, saying that the claims of his attempted rape of Karen Mauk were made up by police. That appeal was immediately rejected. Gossard died on June 7, 1956, at Rockview Penitentiary, located squarely in the middle of nowhere in central Pennsylvania. First, I want to draw your attention to this eyewitness view of the electric chair at Rockview. It's literally a drawing. What the fuck, Nancy Glow Journal? Come on, really? Ugh. All right. Anyway, this was a really sad case to research. I hope I haven't totally killed your Halloween spirit, but I can imagine that a lot of people are going to be kind of outraged at the idea of a mother allowing her 6-year-old daughter to go trick-or-treating unsupervised. It sounds insane right now. It sounds insane today. But back in the 1950s, I wasn't alive back then, but I imagine it was shockingly common to do that kind of thing. Even in the 1970s, when I was 6 years old, yeah, I had all the freedom in the world. I'm just saying times change. If you'd like to see more videos from me, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I hope you have a fun and safe Halloween.